Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting show. I am your host, Tracy Stuckrath, founder of Thrive Meetings and Events and this podcast, Eating at a Meeting, which I started last summer during the middle of the pandemic. And since then, I have talked to more than 80 experts in all facets of food and beverage, from doctors and farmers and chefs to eaters, all talking about how to create safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences that are accessible for everyone. And a couple of weeks ago on a road trip with my niece, I stopped in New Orleans. And when I did that, before going to New Orleans, I researched the La Dames d'Escoffier, which is an organization, a nonprofit organization of women in the hospitality, food, and beverage arena. And they have a New Orleans chapter. And I reached out to a few people on that membership to see who I could come by and visit and what I should be doing. And I found Liz Williams, my guest today. And she is the founder of the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans. And she's author of a number of books about New Orleans food culture. One being New Orleans, a food biography, or they both are called New Orleans, a food biography, and then Lift Your Spirits. So welcome to the show, Liz. Hi.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
I'm so excited for you to be here too. And just to go back to that visit, if you haven't been to the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans, you need to stop by. Not only is it a really cool museum, but they also offer cooking classes in the back, and they have a really great event space with a full bar and kitchen that you can do really cool events. So I'm going to give you that plug up front, and I'll give it to you again later too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So when we met, you took me on a tour of this museum, and one part of that tour was telling me how you came about this, because you weren't in food and beverage when you started this.
No.
Can you tell everybody about the museum and how it came about?
Sure. So the whole idea came to me after I had worked at the University of New Orleans, and we opened several museums there. But before that, when I was in college, I had always been interested in food and culture. And this was the antediluvian times. And at that time, there was no way to really study food and culture. So I became a lawyer, as people do when they don't know what to do. But I kept my interest in food and culture. It's amazing. We really explored the world as a culture. We explored the world because we were looking for peppercorns and nutmeg and things like that. That drove this whole circumnavigation of the globe. And so it was that kind of thing, that connection between food and culture and how important food is to our lives, that I really wanted to study. And so once I had gotten my toes wet in the idea of the museum world, I thought, well, let's do a museum about food. And that is what really drove me to create this museum. It was one of those ideas that I couldn't shake. Even though nobody was going, oh, yes, Liz, here's $1 million. I still just couldn't let it go. And so I said, okay, I've got to do it regardless of whether or not it's a good idea or not. I have to pursue it. And so I did. It was just one of those things that you felt, I'm going to regret it if I don't try.
That's fantastic. And I'm glad that you did, because it is really, really fun. And you started with pop-ups, right? Around the city?
Yes. So when we first started talking to people about it, people had no idea what a food museum might be. And, you have to be able to explain it to people. And it was easier to do an exhibit, than it was to try to describe it in words. So we decided, okay, pop-ups. Of course, that name pop-up didn't exist at the time. We used to call it exhibits in borrowed spaces. Very clunky. And now, of course, in retrospect, we call them pop-up exhibits, but that's not what they were when we first started doing them.
And when people saw that, they actually just grasped onto that?
Yes, I think people said, oh, yes, of course. And of course, we were doing it in New Orleans, where people are very food conscious anyway, and really have a subliminal, if not an actual overt understanding that food and culture go together. So, there's just nothing that we do that doesn't involve food and drink.
Well, and so it's funny that you say that, because in my presentations, and I just gave one last Friday for MPI Carolinas, and I'm like, I asked the question, what is food? What does food mean to you? And I asked the audience, and I have on my screen, I have its livelihood, its traditions, its religion, its memories, its danger for some. There's so many different connotations that food is, but it's our common ground. James Beard, it's our common ground. It's our universal experience.
Absolutely. I mean, there is almost nothing else. I mean, maybe air that connects us all the way food does. And we just can't live without it, obviously. And that's a literal statement.
Right. That's very true. And I like the fact that you said we're traveling around the world to find peppercorns or find, whatever. And Cynthia Graubert was talking about blueberries, right? A couple of weeks ago, and, in Maine and wherever the blueberries are, but finding those. And I think that adds to the different culture, because what we eat in Seattle and what you eat in New Orleans is kind of different.
Oh, totally. And that shows how food is connected to geography. Obviously, you're going to eat the fish that are in the waters where you are. And obviously now, of course, we have refrigeration and all kinds of shipping opportunities. But in the beginning, that's not the way it was. You ate what was around you.
That's very true, because we didn't have 18-wheelers either.
That's right.
We had wagon wheels.
Right.
Yes. And horses. So
and before that, we had feet.
That's true. Yes. Very important thing to note. So when you define how food is culture, or culture is food, how do you describe that or define that?
Well, I think that it's easier to actually give people examples than it is to absolutely define it.
Okay.
Cuisine was defined by Sidney Mintz, the anthropologist, and he had 3 points that made something a cuisine. So that is, number one, everybody in the area, in that geographic area that you're talking about, eats the food. They eat the same food. Number two, anyone who eats the food wherever they are recognizes it. So if I go to your house, let's say we're talking about New Orleans food. If I go to your house and I eat gumbo, I eat your gumbo, it's going to be different from my gumbo. But when I'm at your table, I know this is gumbo. Okay. I recognize that it's still gumbo, even though it's different than my gumbo.
Okay.
And number three, we all identify with that food. In other words, I know you are one with this region because you serve gumbo. And so those three things create a cuisine. Now that cuisine is not culture, but that's the beginning.
Okay.
And then culture is what we do with it, how we serve it, what it means to us when we do it. So it's the implements. It's, do we use chopsticks or do we use forks and knives? Do we eat with bread? Do we eat with our fingers? When is all of that allowed? Do we burp after we eat or not? Because does it mean this is delicious, or does it mean I'm an impolite person? All of these things are part of the culture. If you eat at 10 o'clock at dinner at 10 o'clock at night, and you take a siesta so that you're not really hungry, you're staying up late, that's a different cultural practice than those people who eat at 5:30 every night, And so all of those things are the culture of food.
That is so cool. And I mean, we take a lot of that for granted.
Yes, totally. We think this is, with a capital letter, but it's not. And the more you travel and the more you see the way other people live, the more you realize this is very fluid. And, it's not the same everywhere. I mean, just think about sweet tea, for example. Sweet tea in some places is tea. When you order iced tea, it comes sweet. Other places, like in New Orleans, you have to ask for sweet tea because when you order tea, it comes unsweetened. That little thing can change in 50 miles. And that is culture. I remember I went to a conference in Mississippi, and there was sweet tea to drink, and there was a lemonade, but there was no water.
Oh,
and
wow.
So I thought to myself, what if you are a diabetic and you can't drink this? I had to, and I didn't want that sweetness. So, because to me, sweet tea is like it hurts your teeth, it's just so
Actually, some of them, yes.
Yes. And so I had to take my cup and find a water fountain to get water because they didn't even have a pitcher of water. And when I asked for one, they looked at me like, who wants water? So
that's amazing. Really interesting conversation. That's a very interesting thought process because I've been, I talk about alcohol and only, 30% of people do not drink. But you also, I like that conversation around the sweetness of, and we always use water or soda as the go-to at bars, right?
Yes.
So that's a completely different way to look at it. I like that way to look at it too.
And I, of course, if I'm not going to drink at a bar, I often ask for sparkling water because then it feels like you've ordered something as opposed to asking for a glass of water.
Right. Exactly. Yes. And I do the same. I want my sparkling when I go out. Now, coming from the museum background, and I'm going to jump to, I want to know, why is it important to have a museum about food? And I know that the U.S., the Smithsonian's have an exhibit on food as well that has been around for a couple of years now. I know there's a whole Julia Child's exhibition in there, TV dinners and, kind of that thing. So why is it important that we look at this?
Well, food reflects culture and it influences culture. So if you're going to have an exhibit or a museum that deals with the cultural aspects of things, whether it's comic books or action figures or fashion or any of those things, food fits right into those categories. So there's no reason not to talk about it, number one. Number two, everybody eats. Not everybody cares about comic books. Not everybody cares about action figures, but everybody eats. And so it is actually more universal than almost anything. And that's a thing that I think people have forgotten and are only realizing again now. If you went to a natural history museum, say 30 years ago, that would be probably some kind of a diorama of people searching for food. And then the archaeological finds would be spears and fish hooks and nets and things like that people had found in various archaeological digs. And then once they forget that part and they start to talk about agriculture, then they talk about hierarchy, religion, aesthetics, war. They talk about all kinds of things. And all of a sudden, food is no longer something that you see discussed. Right. It's almost as though people stopped eating. And I mean, really, if you go and you see everything is about food in this prehistoric time, and then all of a sudden there's nothing about food after that, it does make you think that maybe people stopped eating. If I came from another planet, I might come to that conclusion. Anyway, and so now it's being brought up again. But the culture even of those early people, they fished, they gathered, they created baskets, they painted on the walls, they did all those things. But their paintings were often of food, the search for food. So it tells you that even in the earliest days, there was food culture, and food was part of the culture. And you shared food, and you had hospitality, and you had all of these things, which of course people still have, but we forgot to memorialize those things in museums for a good period of time, like 2 millennia or something.
That's that's so true, because when you look at it, I mean, you may have seen, like I said, TV dinners and, in a museum here or there, just to talk about the fact that it's the plate the way we made, the way the food was distributed. But even like in the Air and Space Museum, they talk about the food in the packaging that's sent up to with astronauts, right? But that's about it.
Exactly. And you're going to have more of it discussing the technology of the food and doing it with weightlessness or whatever than maybe how much fun that it might be to eat your food while you're upside down or while you're weightless or whatever. And so there probably are rituals and culture that is developing among the astronauts in a space station or something like that as they have their meals. And are they having them together or individually and all of that sort of thing? That would be interesting to know.
I need to get Richard Branson on the show to ask him.
Absolutely.
He just went into space.
Yes. And Jeff Bezos is going too.
Yeah. That's a totally interesting conversation. So, and when we're planning meetings and events and we're taking people into all these different areas, and a lot of people want to eat like the locals, which is basically they want to eat culturally, if you think about it differently that way, right? Versus going to the tourist areas. How can individuals, and I want to get back to how you have the museum set up, but how can individuals find out more about the culture of where they're going?
I mean, I do think today that it is possible even to Google food culture of Tennessee or Memphis or whatever and actually get responses. I do believe that today there is something about that. However, the problem I see in traveling and trying to understand the food culture is that you still are subject to eating in restaurants when you're traveling. And culture happens at home. Culture, I mean, it could happen at a festival. It could happen in a restaurant. And there is a food culture of the restaurant that is something that you want to be able to experience. But I think if you're really interested in learning about food culture, you go to the grocery stores, you go to the markets. If it's possible, you go to some of the special groceries that might be associated with immigrant communities and things like that. so that you get to see everything that is influencing the food of today in that place. So I think if there's going to be, if there's street food, I would eat that. I would try to really experience everything that I possibly could. And if there's an opportunity to eat in someone's home, I would definitely take it.
Well, and that reminds me, and I don't remember the name of it, but years ago at the MPI meeting, there was a woman who started a company that was kind of like Airbnb, but for dining in people's homes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, and I know that Slow Food has partnered with Airbnb on their experiences aspect so that you can experience the food culture in different cities through Airbnb. But I'm wondering how, I love that whole idea. And I just Googled it really quick. There's one called Traveling Spoon, travel off the eaten path. But, finding those two, because those I think would be a little bit more indicative in, trying to eat in someone's home.
Oh, yes. Yes. I once went on a trip through Sicily, and the company had a number of individuals who would allow you to eat in their home. And I did that. And I did it whether I spoke Italian or not, or whether they spoke English or not, because, if you get in somebody's kitchen and they're rolling pasta, you can just do it with them,
right.
know. And we at one place, it was kind of almost a farm, but it was very small and urban. But they had orange trees, and so we picked oranges to have for dessert, and just all of that sort of thing. They had their own wine, they had made their own olives, all of that kind of stuff, and it was just wonderful. And we practically couldn't talk to each other, but we had fun. But of course, a few glasses of wine really does help.
Of course. But that just goes to show you, just sharing a meal with somebody, whether you can communicate or not, and you could be deaf and blind and speak another language and whatever, but food brings you together. It's that common denominator.
That's right. Absolutely. And even if you eat differently, I also once went to Morocco, and I had a son who was in the Peace Corps, and I had to stop in Morocco and change planes, and the flight got canceled. So we wound up staying in Morocco longer than we expected. So we got a guide to drive us around. And so, of course, he spoke English, but he would take us to places. And in the beginning, it was like all these tourist places and stuff. And we had a little talk with him and said, really, we don't need to eat in these tourist places. And he said, yes, but these are places where they actually have forks, and I'm afraid, to take you. And we said, don't worry about it. Take us anywhere. So he took us to some places where he would eat. And, we had to eat with our bread and all that kind of stuff. And it was like, we just did it, just watch somebody do it and you do it too. And it was so much more fun because people were having, it wasn't other tourists that you were looking at. It was looking at the people who actually live there. And so it was really great. And so I think that it's not the same as eating in someone's home, but as close as you can come,
Oh, I think so too. And before we go any further, everybody, this is Tracy Stockrath, with the host of Eating in a Meeting. And on my show today is my guest, Liz Williams, who is the founder of the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans. And she is a expert in food culture and what that means. And that's what we're talking about. So how has a question that I posed to you beforehand, and how has food culture, why do we need to study it, and how has it changed? And you just Googling those eating in people's homes kind of thing, even with Instagram, and everybody wants to take Instagram photos. Has that changed our culture, the food culture?
Oh, absolutely. My 2-year-old granddaughter tries to take pictures of food.
Wow.
So, and she's just seen other people do it because her parents actually don't do it. And I asked her how she came to want to take pictures of food. And she says, because when I go to restaurants, other people are doing it. So I'm doing it too. So the culture changes, and that's how it happens. You just watch something and that's what you do. I definitely think that food culture is constantly changing, and anybody who tries to stop it from changing kills it. I mean, we have this thing in New Orleans where people want only certain kinds of jazz, jazz before this year. And they want people to go in there, they want to say, well, where can I get Dixieland jazz? Where can I get this kind of jazz? And you say, nobody plays that anymore except for tourists, and maybe because it's not the current thing.
Right.
And I think that if we did that with food, which we have not done, thank goodness, it would die. But you do run across people who think they're being purists, who are saying, oh, we can't, we don't make this the same way anymore. I'm going to give you an example. There's this food we eat called kala, and it is a fried rice fritter.
Okay.
So originally it was made with leftover rice. Let's say you had rice for dinner on one day, and then you kept the rice overnight. You actually made the batter after dinner, and you left it out on the counter, uncovered, so that the yeast in the air would fall into it and start a little fermentation. So that the next day, when you fried those fritter batters that had the leftover rice in it, it would puff up because of the yeast in the air.
Uh-huh.
Well, later, when yeast became available, you would make it the night before and you would inoculate it with some yeast you might have left over from bread or something like that from making bread, so that it puffed up a little bit more than it did from the yeast in the air. But you still had to think about it the night before and all of that kind of stuff. Today, you can just decide, I'm going to take this rice out of the refrigerator. I'm going to whip up the batter this morning and put baking powder in it.
Oh, wow.
And fry it, and it puffs up. But I just did it just spontaneously. It was on a whim this morning.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have to think about it the night before. And then, of course, you have to use it the next day. And so is everybody going to say, oh, we have to go back to using the yeast in the air to do this?
Right.
No, this is a modern way to cook that food. So food changes and the world changes, and we do change with it, whether we're aware of it or not. And so most of these people learned how to make kala with baking powder because baking powder is old now.
Right.
They don't even question it. And that's the thing. It's just like, just because it happened in your lifetime doesn't mean you have to preserve it,
We do that with everything, though.
We do. Yes. But we have to allow things to change. And, when the food changed in New Orleans because around the turn of the century, 1885 to 1915, when all the Sicilians came here, it influenced our food. When the Vietnamese came here after the fall of Saigon in the 1970s, it changed our food. I mean, food is changing all the time. We had all kinds of people from Mexico come after 2005 when we had Hurricane Katrina. Changed our food. You can get oyster tacos now and things like that, because it started to fuse everything together. So I really believe that it constantly changes. And if you try to stop it, you ruin it.
That's so interesting. I mean, but it's still really important to see where it came from too.
Totally.
Yeah. To see how it transformed and remembering grandma's recipe, the fact that I can't remember my grandmother's succotash. My uncle and I cannot figure out what she did to it. We don't know. And she passed away 10 years ago, so we'll never know. But, trying to figure that out and still, loving succotash for just being succotash, right?
Right.
So Diana Canellis posted, put a comment in here. We love going on food walking tours when traveling to experience and learn new places. It's really great and fun way to travel. And I wholeheartedly agree with you.
I do too.
Yeah. And you learn the history of that. And I love those guides that really dig in and know the food culture of where they are. Yeah.
And you get to taste along the way, which is also important because not everything, I mean, maybe a peach is a peach, even though every peach tastes different, it's a peach. But some things you've never tasted before. And so it's always exciting to taste new things.
Right. Yeah. And especially different noodles or fruits or vegetables from different countries that aren't indigenous to where you are. And we should be eating. We should be going back to, we're kind of going back to our roots and eating what's indigenous in our area, trying to, I should say.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not ready to give up coffee, for example, and coffee doesn't grow here, but
that's true.
I want balance here.
Right. Exactly. There is definitely balance in all of that.
And I would also say there has always been trade in food. And so it may not have traded as far, but, you start to think about that nutmeg that people went around the world for in some kind of a sailing ship. They were doing it a long time ago. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't be respectful of the locale as well as seasonality. I do believe in all of that, but I also think it has to be balanced.
I 100%. And a couple of months ago, I had, I'm forgetting her name at the moment, but she was talking about conflict cuisine. And she's got a program at American University on that. And that really talks about that trade and how that happens. And people are utilizing, protecting their land from culture, from people taking it over. And there's so much to it that we don't think about.
Yes. Oh yeah. It is very complicated for sure.
Yeah. Well, now let's talk about the museum a little bit, because I really loved that, that aspect of it. So you have different vignettes. Is that the right way to say that?
Small exhibits about each state in the South. Yes.
And is that from where's this? What do you consider the South?
So what we did was we used the South as defined by the Southeast quadrant. When Eisenhower came back from World War II and he became president, and he said, one of the things that he learned in Germany was that the Autobahn was an efficient system. So then they created 4 quadrants in the country and started to think the Southeast, the Northeast, the Northwest, and the Southwest as 4 quadrants. And so we adopted that as the definition of the South. Okay. So it's not related to the Civil War or the Mason-Dixon line or anything like that. So we have Maryland, for example, as one of the southern states. We also decided not to cut any state in half. So we didn't cut Texas in half as we went west. If part of Texas belongs, then we putting all of Texas in. And I always thought if we ever did a Southwestern museum, it would also include Texas, but all of Texas, because there's no, the food doesn't respect our political state boundaries.
Right. No.
And so since our building is an old market, we treat every state exhibit as a market stall. So unlike a traditional museum where everything is under glass, we really try to, and everything is far apart, we just kind of cram it all together like a market stall. So it feels kind of right. Yeah.
And I will post for everybody, I'll post the Facebook Live that I did walking through the museum. It's not too long, but it was so much fun. Now, so besides that, along the wall on the left, you've got, it's all about beverages.
Right. We have the collection of the Museum of the American Cocktail. So it tells the story of the development of the American cocktail. We have a little section about moonshine, and we also have a section, a gallery that's devoted to absinthe. And that's because it's in New Orleans, and New Orleans was the absinthe drinking capital of America before the ban was created in the early 20th century.
And that was just so interesting. Both of those are interesting, looking at the different bottle shapes and how that all came about, and, and the historical. I mean, I would never have known, about absinthe. I can't say it right. And what that influence had, that it came from New Orleans and went up and around. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we, in the 19th century, it was really interesting. We continued to speak French as a home language, even though the city, and the state was a state. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, we became a state in 1812. You would think, okay, now everybody speaks English. Well, everyone did speak English, but they often spoke French too. And French was the home language. Well, the only way that you got books in French or newspapers in French or any of the things you might want to keep your French alive was to get it from France. And so because absinthe was very, very popular in France, Toulouse-Lautrec and all these people are drinking absinthe, it influenced our interest in absinthe. So that's really how it happened.
So, okay. Now, and what else in the museum? I said at the very beginning too, that you do cooking classes.
Yes, we have a demo kitchen for that.
And that's for the general home cook, correct?
That's correct, yes. And it's on real home appliances, not professional appliances.
Okay.
So nobody has to say, oh, I can't do that because I don't have that salamander or whatever.
And then over on the far right is what used to be a restaurant that you have a full cocktail bar.
Yes.
In that area that can be used. The whole museum can be rented, but that's really can be used as an event space, right?
Yes, that can be an event space. A lot of chefs will rent that restaurant kitchen and do a pop-up in there. People come for happy hour. We absolutely encourage people to get a drink when they come visit the museum and carry it around with them and enjoy the drink while they're visiting the museum. We also have a temporary gallery where we have changing exhibits. And right now, the exhibit is about the electrification of the kitchen and how electricity actually changed what goes in the kitchen, how the kitchen is arranged, because you had to be able to plug things in and all of that kind of stuff. So that one is called the Complete Kitchen, and it's really fun with changing appliances, going from the ice box to the refrigerator and all of that.
That's something interesting. And my family is about to move, and our house does not have gas. And I lived in a house in Atlanta, and I had gas for 15 years. My mom put gas in this current house. So we've been doing that, but our new house doesn't. And I'm like, oh my God, I got to go get an electric stove. I don't know how to do that.
Well, think about an induction stove.
Okay.
Because induction is more like gas than those old-fashioned electric burners are. And so if you have to go all electric, that would be the way to go with less angst.
I need to ask her because she picked it out all on her own. So I need to ask her what she bought. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's actually, toasters and microwaves and all
blenders and food processors. Yeah.
And yes, all juicers. I'm like, instead of taking the old juicer and juicing all those,
can openers.
Oh, wow. And even the one you just put it on the thing and it goes around by itself. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing the number of gadgets and appliances that are electrified. and when you know it, I mean, we certainly know that here in New Orleans, you lose your electricity because the hurricane has just gone through. And, you're so used to using your coffee grinder to have freshly ground coffee in the morning. And you have a little percolator that's not a percolator, it's a drip pot that's also electric. And now you can't make coffee because you have no electricity. So everybody that I know has a hand grinder in the back of their cabinet and some kind of a drip stove because, we have natural gas in Louisiana. So most people have a gas stove. Right. But if you have a gas stove, you probably have to light a match during the hurricane to make it go on. But that's very, very simple to do.
Right. That's so interesting. And actually, as we're cleaning out, I found this contraption, which I posted in the La Dame's Facebook group. And I'm like, okay, who can tell me what it is? And it was an egg slicer.
Ah, yes.
And it's metal and you put the egg in it and it's got 4 pieces of wire in it or 6 pieces of wire and it cuts your egg into perfect pieces, which is, but it was my grandmother's. And I'm like, I am not getting rid of that because it does an awesome job, but it's also was grandma's. Yeah.
Right. Of course.
Yeah. So fun. Now, Zoe put on here too. I love exploring the confluence between food, culture, politics, religion, human behavior. And that's so true because what we've been talking about all morning is that how food, it touches all of those things. I mean, you think about the food code and the WIC program and all of those different things that we again take for granted.
Plus, there are religious restrictions and rules about food. I mean, food touches everything. You can study economics. You can weaponize food and make it a war. Like you can make hunger a weapon of war. I mean, you can use food for anything. You can turn it into art. There's just nothing that food doesn't touch. And that to me is one of the reasons why studying it is so very important.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, I love what you're doing and thank you so much for bringing light to it. Two things that I want to mention is that thank you for this invitation as well, is that the Eating at a Meeting podcast is now part of the Nitty Grits podcasts.
Yes, and so we're very excited about that.
I'm so excited. You want to talk about it, share it with everybody what that means?
Yes. So we have gotten used to curating things here at the museum. And so we decided that we would curate podcasts. And so if there were we created an exhibit for people to choose what podcasts are interesting. And so we are this is a new launch of a project of ours, Nitty Grits Podcasts. And we're excited to have your podcast as one of our new podcast network. And I also have a podcast. It's called Tip of the Tongue. And of course, you are on that podcast, Tracy. And so we have other ones, and we're hoping that at least once a month, we'll be able to roll out a new podcast. And people can listen to their favorite podcasts like yours and then see what else is there and maybe find new podcasts that they would be interested in.
No, I am so excited about it. And we had a kickoff call yesterday with with everybody, and I will post all of that information coming up. And, so that we can share what those different podcasts are, because there's one about drinking in New Orleans and the connected table. And I forgot everyone else's. I think there's 2 more right now, but,
there's the kitchen counter.
Yes.
Yes. Lots of them. Yes,
exactly. All right. So my friend Andrew, just said hello from London. So Andrew, hello, my friend. I haven't seen you in forever. And 2 things about Andrew. One, he lives in London, so there's a big difference in food culture there. Yes. But he also, if I'm correct, still works for the cruise lines. And so that's a whole nother food culture.
Exactly.
Talking about cruises and how what food is served on there and having to store it for 7 days and all of that stuff. So well, Andrew, we need to talk about food on cruising.
That would be fascinating. Yeah,
exactly. All right. So Liz, the last question I want to ask you, and I'm loving this, is because I love both of these things too, is what is your favorite food and what is your favorite drink?
Okay. My absolute favorite food depends on my mood partially, but it's either artichokes or it's Brussels sprouts, depending on my mood.
I love them both.
So, I mean, I could eat them both every day, never get tired of them. I just think they're wonderful. Now, my favorite alcoholic drink is the sazerac. This is the official cocktail of the city of New Orleans. Okay. But I'm also really a fan of coffee. I really like coffee too. But that's my non-alcoholic drink.
Gotcha. All right. So explain sazerac for me, because I've never heard that.
So a sazerac is a drink that's made of rye with Peychaud bitters, which are New Orleans bitters, and it usually traditionally has a sugar cube in it.
Okay.
And but you've rinsed the glass. It's served in a rocks glass, and you rinse the glass with absinthe or absinthe.
Okay.
Not with the idea that that's going to be in the drink so much as when you lift it up to your nose to drink, the perfume affects the flavor of the rye.
Wow.
And then you have an orange or lemon zest in it, and that's it. I mean, so you're really basically drinking straight rye.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, it's really good.
Well, and rye, it's gluten, so I'm not going to be drinking it, but yeah.
Well, you could drink any kind of spirits. You could use brandy or cognac, and that you could make it with that. So it that could work. Just something brown.
Something brown. Okay. Well, tell everybody how they can find the museum.
So they can go to our website, which is southernfood.org, and they'll find me. They'll find Nitty Grits podcast. They'll be able to find almost anything about the museum there.
Okay. Fantastic. And I think your hashtags and all of that on your social media it's all on the website too. So yes.
Right. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being here and being my guest. I'm so excited.
It's been my pleasure. I've had great fun talking to you.
Likewise. And we're going to continue this conversation all the time. So if you're in New Orleans, please go by the Southern Food and Beverage Museum and check it out and take a class or host a party there.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And you can find rental information on that website as well.
That's right. That's right.
Exactly. And then definitely check out the Nitty Grits podcast. Because I'm going to be featured there, which is awesome. But there's a lot of other great food and beverage podcasts out there. And if you have any other ones that think need to be part of Nitty Grits, please let Liz and I know, because we're always looking for great podcasts to join.
Absolutely. Yes.
So everyone, thank you for tuning in. Andrew, I do have a podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and let's talk some more. But this is the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where I talk to experts in all facets of food and beverage. We're here every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern, and you can find us on all podcast platforms going after the fact. So until next time, stay safe and eat well. Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.